Released in November of 2016 for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and developed and published by Square Enix. It's Final Fantasy 15. What you're seeing on screen now is the PlayStation 4 version of the game running on a standard PS4. However, Final Fantasy XV's history goes very far back. Originally announced at E3 2006 as Final Fantasy Versus 13 as a PlayStation 3 exclusive, as part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy, which means New Tale of the Crystal in Latin. Originally intended to be a compilation of games under the Final Fantasy XIII banner, the trio of games originally intended to be was Final Fantasy XIII, Versus 13, and Edito 13, with the goal of each game to be based on and expand upon common mythos of the universe in Final Fantasy XIII. The theme of Versus 13 was a fantasy based on reality, basically meaning to take place in a setting similar to modern times in a more contemporary Earth. However, as we all now know, Final Fantasy XIII would end up becoming a series all into its own. Final Fantasy Edito 13 would end up becoming Final Fantasy Type 0 for the PSP and PlayStation 4, and aims to become its own series. As for Final Fantasy Versus 13, it never ended up going anywhere initially. The game would stay in pre-production with extremely long periods of media silence, years even, which overall left many fans and news outlets assuming the worst and that the game was cancelled. However, 9 years later at E3 2013, the game was officially rebranded and re-announced as Final Fantasy 15. As for the plot of the game itself, without spoiling anything, you play as Noctis Lucis Calum, the crown prince of the royal city of Insomnia. Without too much context, you and your three friends Gladiolus, Ignis, and Prompto set on a road trip to Accordo's capital city, Altissa, where Noctis is to bewed Lunafreya the Oracle for plot reasons. However, on the way there, in between car troubles, hours of fishing, camping, hunting, and sleeping in a single tent together, your city gets leveled by the Empire, a big crystal is stolen, Jesse from Breaking Bad is there, and you're presumed dead, which is all explained and shown in a separate movie, but we'll get to that later. So it's up to Noctis and pals to gather the weapons of his ancient ancestors and former kings of Lucis to dip at the crystal and reclaim his throne. But is the game itself any good? Let's find out first with the good. A lot of games' strongest aspects are usually visuals or some sort of gameplay mechanic, sometimes even the story, but not too many I feel like have the strong aspect of a great cast of characters, which is exactly what 15 certainly has. Traveling around and exploring with Noctis and his friends is easily the highlight and most enjoyable aspect of this game. Each of them are vastly different in personality, they all have their own bits of dialogue they share when exploring and their own unique skill sets.
Have I mentioned I'm acrophobic?
Don't fear heights, fear falling.
From Prompto's photography and use of pistols, to Ignis's cooking and primarily playing support and use of spears, and Gladio's survival skill and basically being your tank, to Noctis, who can fish, which I spent an embarrassing amount of time doing actually. And of course, with Noctis and his best pals in tow, you have the vast open world to explore and road trip in, with plenty of side quests to do, such as monster hunting or hunt quests in general, taking photos, collecting specific rare items, or feeding a cat. Then of course you have different dungeons you can explore as well, everything from going down into a spooky mine, to climbing a lava-ridden mountain, most of which usually reward you at the end with a weapon from your ancestors. The dungeon designs are all varied and well done, and thankfully the game doesn't have any form of level scaling either, so these dungeons also give you a good reason to come back later, or you can try and explore them at a lower level just to see how far you can get before either dying or leaving. Or in my case, usually dying. Now, graphically speaking, Final Fantasy has always been a series with incredible visuals and art style, and that is still definitely present here in 15. If you can get past the boy band aesthetics of the cast of characters, the world of Eos has plenty of different sights to see and explore, and it looks gorgeous. But not only that, the presentation is distinctly Final Fantasy. Everything from starting up the game for the first time and hearing the sound effects, to the sprites of the characters in your menu, to the soundtrack, Final Fantasy XV definitely is deserving of its namesake in this regard. As for the gameplay, 15 has gone with an action RPG approach like most of the modern Final Fantasy games as of late, as opposed to being a turn-based game like the classic Final Fantasy games. And to be honest, I'm perfectly okay with this. The combat in Final Fantasy XV may seem a bit on the simple side at first, as you basically hold down circle to attack and square to dodge. But then once you start moving the analog stick around and do different combos while fighting, you start finding the depth there and you dig deeper, switching up weapons mid-combo or using specific weapons on enemies that are weak to them. The weighty, awesome feeling of using a massive sword or cleaver to switch into a small, single-handed sword or blade for a quick and precise attack perfect for doing counterattacks, or using a spear and jumping around in midair and unleashing a barrage of aerial assaults, to then also commanding your teammates to do specific techniques, or hitting an enemy's blind spot and landing a group combo, to then using magic, and that's when you're blowing shit up and the environment around you is getting charred from the aftermath. Then you can start combining different elements and different items you find to get different effects. Just be careful your friends don't get too close. Then of course there's the rare event where you can trigger a summon.
Why don't we just do that every time?
Easy for you to say.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Personally, I think the combat in this game is great, especially after having sunk over 100 hours into it and still have fun with it. But let's not forget about the Chocobos that can also buff you and do attacks. And the Chocobos in general are an absolute blast. Here's 16-bit's #1 tip. Screw doing side quests and race to chapter 3 and do them then. So you can then use your Chocobos. It's the only way to travel in this game, regalia be damned. You've also got Chocobo races, which really aren't all that great, but they teach you the tricks and techniques of how to master your Chocobo riding skills. Different foods to feed them for stat boosts, jumping, swimming, drifting, not to mention that incredible Chocobo theme music. On the topic of music, this is Final Fantasy. An incredible soundtrack is just to be expected, and Final Fantasy 15 is no different. But not only that, if there is one redeeming factor to the regalia, you can listen to previous Final Fantasy soundtracks in it, making those long road trips all the more comfy. As for the voice acting, surprisingly enough, the English voice acting is pretty spectacular, which is something I definitely can't say about the previous Final Fantasy games. My favorite being Ignis. He has so many memorable quips and lines that will forever be burned into my mind.
That's it!
What's up, Iggy?
I've come up with a new recipe.
Locked! What's wrong? Are you okay?
It's not me. It's my spectacles.
Your glasses? Well, how come they're not on your face?
But now let's discuss what I'd rather forget, with the bad. Whoever thought making the X button interact with NPCs and also the button for jumping is hopefully out of a job, or soon to be at Square Enix. But next up, despite watching the movie and seeing the insane car shenanigans in that film, in the actual game, however, yeah, unfortunately the car in this game is basically on a rail system. You more or less can just set the controller down if you wish and let Ignis drive. Or you could drive, but you still don't have any actual real control over the vehicle except for speed, and you can make very slight shifts of movement on the road itself, and do U-turns, and you can turn when needed, I guess? Or you can be like Seraph and somehow still crash the car despite all this. On a technical standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, this game looks fairly solid and has some nice art direction, but honestly, this isn't really much of a graphical showcase. Sure, the character models look fantastic, but just don't look too far off in the distance behind them. The textures in most of the environments in the distance look absolutely dreadful and can even be really jarring at times. However, compared to the original Dust Day demo overall, the game's frame rate is a huge improvement, so I'm happy to report during my over 100 hours with it, I very rarely suffered from any frame rate drops. As for bugs and glitches, during my time spent with Final Fantasy 15, there are definitely a few notable things such as pop-in issues, characters going invisible, weird things in the environment in general, to just other craziness. However, probably Final Fantasy 15's weirdest and possibly the absolute worst thing about this game, and this is gonna sound a bit off considering how much I just praised its cast of characters, is the story. In short, it's a clusterfuck. Square Enix attempted this quote-unquote expanded universe by giving the game its own movie, its own anime, and at first I thought, whatever, it's just a spin-off probably or some sort of retelling, nothing too important. But honestly, after watching the movie, it's almost required if you want any kind of context or setup to the story when you first play the game. Otherwise, you'll feel extremely disconnected to the events going on in the city, as the game pretty much just glances over it all and just expects that you watch the movie. As for the anime, unfortunately, it's in the same category. If you want any of the characters' backstory or knowledge of how they all first met, you need to watch the anime. And the problem with that is, people who have no knowledge of this and are just buying the game outright or just getting it as a gift or something and start playing it, aren't going to have a lot of very important context. But funny enough, despite all that stuff, that's not even the worst aspect of the story in this game. Without giving away too much or spoil anything, I'll just say this. The last 3 or so chapters of this game are absolutely dreadful. It's such a change in tone and design, in such an awful way though, that it's just an absolute slog to play through. I would say it almost ruined this game for me. It's that bad. One of the key reasons for this, once again being the story itself, there is just outright missing context, story, character development, and the story pretty much just falls apart into an obscure mess by the end of it all.
Oh my gosh, and the guy, and he's over here, and the king, and the crystal! What?
Worse yet, it seems like it's going to be just sold back to us through DLC in the Season Pass. And that is just completely unacceptable. But now it's time I give the opinion. At the end of the day, Final Fantasy XV is still a great game in terms of gameplay, the gorgeous world of Eos that you can explore, filled with tons of side content to do, and it boasts a wonderful cast of characters. But in terms of overall story, it's obvious it's been through so much development hell and story rewrites and design changes, and despite this ridiculously long development cycle, it yet somehow ended up being rushed out the door and arguably in some ways is unfinished. And because of all this, I can't genuinely recommend this game right now. My advice is to wait for the Director's Cut or the Ultimate Edition or whatever version has the finished intended product. But on a more positive note, shouts out to my co-host Sam, who actually bought this game for me for Christmas, and best yet it was the deluxe edition of the game, which came in this beautiful steel case. So thank you again. But now it's time I give the rating.
Yeah!